The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Victor Westbrook leaned back in his chair, the gleam of a predatory smile on his lips. Clara Bennett stood at the table, her pad in hand, waiting for his order. It wasn't the first time she'd seen that look, one of superiority born from money and power. It was the look of someone who believed the world owed him everything. "You know, I don't usually like to eat in places like this," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet buzz of the upscale restaurant. He glanced around at the gleaming silverware and marble countertops with disdain. "But I suppose the staff here does its best, don't they?" Clara's smile was small, polite, as it always was when dealing with difficult customers. But in her chest a knot twisted. She had learned long ago to smile through the humiliation, to keep her voice steady, even when her blood boiled beneath the surface. "I'll take the salmon." "Please," he continued, his eyes trailing over her from head to toe, not bothering to hide the judgment. He leaned in closer, just enough to make her uncomfortable. "And do you think you could find a way to, I don't know, improve the vibe here? Maybe make it a little less, well, you?" The laughter that followed was laced with cruelty, and a few patrons nearby turned their heads, sensing the tension. Clara, her heart pounding, forced her posture to remain unwavering. Her voice was soft, but her eyes locked with his, steady and calm. "I'm afraid I don't have any control over the atmosphere, sir. But I'll make sure the food meets your expectations." She turned to walk away, but his voice stopped her. "Wait," he called out, an insidious edge to his tone. "I was just wondering, what's it like, working in a place like this? Serving people like me? Must be humiliating, huh?" The question stung, but Clara didn't flinch. Not outwardly. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The customers around the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had heard the words, but they had done nothing. Clara turned slowly, her face still composed, but her eyes colder than before. "I don't let others define my worth, sir. I do my job with dignity no matter who you are." The room was silent. The words weren't just for Victor Westbrook. They were for everyone who had ever made her feel small, overlooked, or less than. Victor's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. The others in the restaurant felt it too. The smugness of the moment shattered. Clara walked away, her back straight as the weight of the encounter settled around her. But inside, her thoughts swirled like a storm. What had just happened? Why had she spoken up when every fiber of her being screamed to let it go? She could feel the eyes of the room still on her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. The truth had slipped out in a moment of unexpected clarity, and now, as the air around her seemed to thicken with the weight of her own decision, Clara knew something had changed. The world had just become a little less forgiving, and she was ready to face it. The room was still, as though time itself had stopped. Clara's words hung in the air, sharp and quiet. "I don't let others define my worth, sir. I do my job with dignity no matter who you are." For a long moment, no one spoke. Not Victor, not the patrons, not even the hum of the restaurant's busy kitchen could break the tension. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Victor Westbrook stared at Clara, his smirk faltering for the briefest moment. The flicker of discomfort in his eyes was quickly masked by a more familiar expression, irritation, mixed with embarrassment. He wasn't used to being confronted, not like this. Certainly not by someone like her. He opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it again. For a second, it seemed as though he might apologize, but the words never came. Instead, he sat back in his chair, the facade of superiority sliding back into place. The moment had passed. He believed it was over. Clara turned, her shoulders square, her head high. Her face was calm, but inside her heart was pounding. Her feet moved toward the kitchen, but each step felt heavier. As she walked, she could feel the weight of the room pressing against her. The patrons were still watching her, some with pity, others with discomfort. They had seen it all. The sneer, the mockery, the quiet dignity of her response. They had witnessed the power struggle, and they had done nothing. They had let it happen. Her fingers tightened around the notepad she still held in her hand, knuckles white. She could still hear the echo of his words in her mind, replaying in a loop. Humiliating. You. The sting of them, sharp and familiar, pierced through her resolve. It wasn't the first time someone had belittled her in front of others, but this was different. This time she had responded. This time she had stood her ground. Back at her station, Clara closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to push down the storm of emotions rising inside her. The years of quiet endurance, of taking the slights and insults in silence, had built to this moment. She had lived her whole life in the shadows of other people's expectations, silently enduring their assumptions about who she was. But in that moment, she had shown them who she was, who she would no longer allow them to define. Her hands shook as she put the notepad down. But there was something else in her, something more than the bitterness of the past. There was a sense of power, a quiet kind of strength that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She glanced toward Victor, still seated at his table, now surrounded by a new layer of awkwardness. His colleagues avoided his gaze, the conversation faltering. But he didn't see it. He didn't see the ripple of discomfort spreading through the room, or the subtle shift in the way people were starting to look at him. No, Victor Westbrook didn't understand. He didn't understand what it meant to be looked at through the lens of someone else's privilege, to have your worth dictated by people who never bothered to see you as a person. He couldn't possibly understand what it took for Clara to hold her ground, and that, Clara realized, was the true weight of her response. It wasn't about making him feel bad. It wasn't about winning the moment. It was about the truth, standing firm against a world that asked her to bend, to be small, to remain invisible. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the silence, the weight of her decision settling over her. She had spoken, but now what? What did it matter if someone like Victor didn't even know the damage he caused? What was the point of confronting the powerful when they couldn't see their own faults? The challenge was bigger than one man. It was bigger than one moment. It was about a system that allowed men like him to continue, unbothered by the lives they trampled. The truth was there, but would it ever be enough? Clara didn't know yet, but she could feel it. Something had changed, and this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. The weight of it all pressed down on her as she stepped back into the flow of the restaurant, returning to her duties, her mind already shifting to the next step. But somewhere deep inside, the seed of something larger had been planted. She had spoken the truth. Now, the question was whether she could hold on to it in a world that demanded silence. The sound of her mother's voice was sharp and clear, cutting through the quiet of the old apartment. Clara, remember this. You are not what they say you are. You are not less. Clara, a little girl then, had sat on the floor, the weight of those words pressing on her small shoulders. Her mother's voice had always carried the force of 1,000 lessons. Lessons she never asked for but had to learn. As a former civil rights activist, her mother had lived through protests, marches, and the harsh glare of injustice. And now she was teaching Clara how to survive in a world that would always look at her and see only what they wanted to see. Clara's mother, Rosa Bennett, was a woman of pride and unshakable resolve. She was the kind of woman who could stare down a storm and make it bend. But her pride wasn't just in her past. It was in her daughter. I didn't fight for this, Rosa would say, her eyes hard as she looked out the window. So you could shrink yourself for them. You are more than that. But the world Clara grew up in had its own ideas about who she was. In school, the whispers started early. She's too loud, they would say. She's too much. They never said it to her face, but Clara heard them all the same. It was the look, the sideways glance, the way people would step back when she walked into a room. She wasn't just black. She was too black. Clara could still remember the heat of those summers, the small apartment where her mother worked long hours at a nearby hospital, and Clara spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, watching the city move on without her. The TV was always on, the news playing in the background, stories of police brutality, of young black men and women being torn apart by a system that didn't care, of people who looked like her being crushed under the weight of their own skin. Her mother had taught her to stand tall against that. But it had never been easy. It was always a fight, a silent one most days. In high school, Clara had tried to fit in. She had tried to laugh at the same jokes, to be what they wanted her to be. But it never worked. She was never quite right. When she spoke too loudly, it was aggressive. When she took up space, it was threatening. When she succeeded, it was because she was the exception, not the rule. One evening, when Clara was 15, her mother sat her down after a particularly rough day at school. Clara had come home bruised, emotionally exhausted from a fight she never wanted to be a part of. "You know, honey," her mother began, her voice calm but heavy with meaning, "the world will make you believe that you have to be small to be safe. But I'll tell you right now, being small only makes them forget who you are. They'll crush you thinking they've silenced you." Clara had wanted to say something then, to argue or cry or shout, but she didn't. Instead, she just listened, absorbing her mother's words like they were a lifeline. The truth was clear. There was no room for silence, not for her. Not in a world that would never see her as equal. The quiet endurance she had learned wasn't strength. It was survival. And survival was never enough. Now, as an adult, Clara found herself standing in that same place. The place where silence felt like it might suffocate her. Where every moment of quiet compliance threatened to choke the life out of her spirit. She had spent so much of her life holding back anger, pride, the need for justice, just to fit in, just to survive. But standing in that upscale restaurant, facing Victor Westbrook and his cruel remarks, something had shifted. That old weight, the one her mother had carried, was now Clara's to bear, and for the first time she felt the weight of it as power, not a burden. The lessons of her mother had always been clear, but they were more than just words. They were her strength, and now Clara understood something deep in her bones. Silence wasn't strength. It was complicity. She could no longer pretend she didn't see the injustice around her. She could no longer stay quiet. The cost of silence had been too high for too long, and Clara had finally reached the point where it was time to speak, to stand, and to be seen. Victor Westbrook's world was a fortress of glass and steel, a city of wealth and influence where the sun always seemed to shine just a little brighter for him. His penthouse overlooked the skyline, an endless stretch of skyscrapers that reflected his own towering ambitions. Every inch of his life was polished, from the sleek cars parked in his private garage to the tailored suits that fit him like armor. In this world, nothing was ever out of reach, but there was a coldness to it all. A coldness that Victor had long ago stopped noticing. He was used to being at the top. His hands gripped the reins of a multinational company, and his every move was followed by a team of assistants and advisors. They knew their place. He knew the staff, the waiters, the cleaners. He regarded them as little more than invisible figures, filling roles he no longer saw as people. To him, they were tools, nothing more. In meetings, he would lean back in his chair, fingers drumming on the armrest, eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that could cut through glass. He was always in control, always above the fray. At a recent board meeting, he dismissed a report on employee wages with a casual flick of his wrist. "Who cares about what they earn? They do their job, and that's enough," he said, his voice dripping with indifference. The room of executives nodded in unison, as though the very thought of considering the workers' struggles was beneath them. Later that afternoon, as he made his way through the lobby of his company's headquarters, he passed a janitor cleaning the floor. Without breaking stride, Victor tossed a few crumpled bills onto the polished surface, never pausing to look at the man. The janitor, whose hands were worn with years of work, nodded in silent acknowledgement. Victor did not notice the man's weary eyes. His world was full of these little exchanges, small acts of superiority that went unnoticed in the rush of his daily life. To Victor, they were just the natural order of things. The powerful rose, the weak served. That was the way it had always been. But then, everything had shifted. Clara Bennett's words from the restaurant echoed in his mind at unexpected moments. "I do my job with dignity, no matter who you are." The phrase gnawed at him, making his skin crawl with discomfort. He was not used to being challenged, not by someone like her. He was a billionaire, the kind of man who was expected to be praised, not questioned. But that moment, when she had turned and walked away, standing firm in the face of his cruelty, had lingered. He found himself replaying the scene over and over, unable to shake the image of her calm composure. The arrogance he had felt moments before had slipped away, replaced by something else: doubt. Victor sat at his desk that evening, the glow of his computer screen casting a cold light across his face. His usual confidence had been replaced with an unfamiliar tension. His phone rang, but he didn't pick it up. Instead, he stared out the window at the city he had built, and for the first time, he wondered if it was all worth it. What had he really gained? The power, the money, did they make him better than everyone else? Or had they simply allowed him to hide from the reality of what he had become? In his mind, Victor could still see Clara's eyes, sharp, unyielding, full of a strength he could not ignore. For the first time in years, he questioned whether he had crossed a line, whether the small cruelties of his daily life had added up to something darker, something he could no longer justify. But as the night wore on and the thoughts continued to churn in his mind, the old patterns began to resurface. He had responsibilities, his company, his investors, the image he had spent years building. He couldn't afford to let one encounter disrupt everything. He couldn't afford to let someone like Clara Bennett make him question himself. Victor sat back in his chair, trying to push away the uncomfortable thoughts. The city lights flickered below, an endless sea of motion. He was at the top. He couldn't let a moment of doubt take that away from him. But even as he told himself this, a small part of him, deep inside, where he had long buried it, wondered if he could ever really go back to the way things were before. It began as a whisper, then became a wave. By the next morning, the confrontation at the Mariner's table had found its way beyond the polished floors of the restaurant. A customer, one of the silent witnesses that day, had recorded a short clip on their phone, a few seconds of tension that showed Victor Westbrook's smirk and Clara Bennett's poised reply. The video was shaky, but the message was clear. Power meeting dignity, arrogance meeting restraint. The clip spread across social media like fire through dry grass. By noon, hashtags were forming. Dignity and service. Through the waitress and the CEO. Some called Clara brave. Others called her foolish. The comment sections filled with opinions, arguments, and debates that had little to do with the real woman at the center of it all. Clara knew none of this. At that hour, she was tying her apron again, preparing for another day at work. The restaurant felt different, quieter, eyes heavier. Her coworkers stole glances, whispering in corners. The manager, usually brisk, seemed nervous, checking his phone more often than the schedule. Clara sensed something, but no one spoke plainly. When her friend Mia finally told her, Clara froze mid-step. They're talking about you. Online. Everywhere. Clara's first reaction was disbelief. Then unease. She hadn't wanted attention. She'd only wanted to keep her dignity intact. The idea that the world now knew about that moment, the worst kind of public humiliation turned into spectacle, made her chest tighten. That night, after her shift, she sat at her small kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. There she was, her name, her face, her words, spinning through endless comments and headlines. Some messages were kind, many were not. She put him in his place. She should have just stayed quiet. She'll lose her job for this. Each sentence cut differently. The world was talking about her, yet not a single person seemed to truly see her. Across town, in his marble office, Victor Westbrook was facing a storm of his own. His public relations team sat in a tense circle around the long conference table, screens open to news feeds and social platforms. His face was everywhere, his sneer frozen mid-insult. "This is bad, Victor," his advisor said carefully. "You need to respond fast." Victor leaned back, his jaw tight. "It was nothing. A misunderstanding, not to them," another advisor replied. "They're saying you demeaned a waitress. People are calling for boycotts." Victor's eyes flicked to the screen where his own face stared back at him. Cold, condescending, untouchable. The image made him uncomfortable. For the first time, he saw what others saw. The power he wore like a second skin now looked like a stain he couldn't wash off. He pushed the laptop away. "Prepare a statement," he said. His voice was sharp, but there was a hint of something else beneath it. Hesitation, maybe guilt. The meeting dragged on, the advisors arguing over tone and phrasing, trying to polish his image. But Victor's mind was elsewhere. Clara's words echoed again. "I do my job with dignity, no matter who you are." He rubbed his temples. That sentence, so simple, so unshakable, had struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He'd faced competition, failure, and betrayal in business, but never truth like that. Truth didn't negotiate. It lingered. Meanwhile, Clara's life was tilting under the weight of exposure. Customers came in asking for her section, whispering when she passed. Her manager told her to be careful, though he couldn't explain what that meant. Some co-workers looked at her with admiration, others with envy. One older waiter said quietly, "You did the right thing, but right things don't always pay the bills." Clara didn't answer. She just kept working, every motion steady, her eyes calm even as the noise around her grew. She hadn't asked for any of this, the fame, the criticism, the moral debate, but she understood what it meant. The truth had power. It spread whether you wanted it to or not. As the night drew in, Victor stared out the window of his office, the city glowing beneath him. Below those lights were thousands of people, some who adored him, some who despised him, and one woman whose words had shaken the ground he stood on. For the first time, he felt the smallest tremor of fear, not of losing money, but of losing himself. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching between two people who would likely never speak again, yet were now tied together by something larger than both of them. The world had seen the truth, and neither could undo it. The world's noise had reached his doorstep, and Victor Westbrook could no longer ignore it. He arrived at the Mariners' table unannounced, his presence slicing through the quiet like a blade. The lunch crowd was thin, but the air was heavy. Waiters moved with the tense awareness that something was about to happen. Clara Bennett stood near the counter, checking orders, her expression calm but distant. She hadn't expected to see him again. Victor adjusted his cufflinks, the small silver pair engraved with his initials, a symbol of power and control. Today they felt heavier than usual. He scanned the room, spotted her, and approached. Every step echoed with purpose, but underneath that, something else. Uncertainty. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "May I have a word?" Clara looked up slowly, meeting his eyes. The calmness in her gaze unsettled him. Around them, the restaurant seemed to shrink, the murmurs fading into silence. "Of course," she said quietly. "Though I'm on shift." He smiled, the kind of smile meant to disarm. "I'll be brief." They moved to an empty table in the corner. Victor sat down first, uninvited as if instinct demanded it. Clara stood across from him, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron. "I wanted to clear the air," Victor began. "I realize my words the other day may have been misinterpreted." "Misinterpreted?" Clara repeated, her tone even. He nodded, pressing forward. "I didn't mean to offend you personally. I was simply—" He paused, searching for words that might sound human, trying to lighten the mood. "My humor can be direct." Clara's silence filled the space. The faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen was the only sound between them. "Mr. Westbrook," she said at last, her voice steady, "you didn't offend me because of your humor. You offended me because you believed you could." Victor blinked, caught off guard. Clara continued, her tone still calm but her words cutting with precision. "You spoke to me as if your money made you untouchable. You mocked me because you assumed people like me wouldn't speak back. That's not misunderstanding, sir. That's entitlement." For a moment, Victor didn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt. No one had ever spoken to him that way. Not in boardrooms, not in interviews, not even in private. He tried to recover, offering a thin smile. "You're right, I could have handled it better. But you must understand people like me." Clara's eyes hardened. "That's the problem. People like you always explain. You never listen." Victor's words faltered. The confidence that usually shielded him was slipping, piece by piece. Across from him, Clara wasn't angry. She wasn't dramatic or loud. She was composed, deliberate, like someone who had carried truth her whole life and finally decided to set it down where it could be seen. "I don't hate you, Mr. Westbrook," she said softly. "But I do see what men like you represent. You walk into rooms and people move aside. You say things that cut others down, and they laugh because they're afraid not to. And maybe you don't even notice it anymore. But the rest of us, we live with it every day." Victor's gaze fell to the table. The reflection in the polished surface caught his own face, but it looked smaller than usual. Tired. Even human. He glanced at his cufflinks, the silver glint dull now under the restaurant lights. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but no words came. He only nodded slightly, the silence between them heavy but strangely freeing. Clara took a breath, her voice gentler now. I don't need your apology, sir. What I need is for you to remember this moment the next time you speak to someone who can't speak back." Her words landed with quiet force. Victor looked up, but she had already stepped away, called by another table that needed her attention. He remained seated, frozen in thought. Around him, life resumed. The hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses. But it all felt distant. The power that had always defined him suddenly felt hollow, like a shell cracking from the inside. As he left the restaurant, Victor glanced once more at Clara, now busy serving another customer. She didn't look his way. She didn't need to. Outside, the light was harsh against the city glass. Victor paused, his reflection staring back at him. Immaculate suit, perfect tie, but eyes clouded with something new. Recognition. For the first time, he wasn't sure who he was looking at. The applause had faded. What remained was silence, and the wait that followed it. Clara Bennett stood behind the restaurant's counter, wiping down spotless glasses that no longer needed her attention. Every motion was automatic. Her mind, however, was somewhere else. Ever since the confrontation with Victor Westbrook, her world had turned upside down. The video of that moment, her quiet defiance, had become more than a viral clip. It had become a debate, a symbol, a weapon in other people's hands. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some called her brave, a voice for the voiceless. Others called her unprofessional, claiming she had embarrassed a customer. And now the fallout had begun. 2 days earlier, her manager had called her into the office. His words had been careful, measured as though he were reading from a script. "You've brought a lot of attention to the restaurant, Clara. Some of it, not good." She had nodded, keeping her expression steady even as her stomach turned. The message beneath his politeness was clear. The owners were worried about the brand, about losing high-paying clients. Victor Westbrook's name still carried power, even after the backlash. That night, Clara lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city hummed outside her window. Her phone buzzed again and again. Texts, messages, and emails from people she didn't know. Some thanked her for speaking up. Others told her she'd ruined her career. Her mother called the next morning. The warmth in her voice was like a lifeline. "I saw the news, baby. You did what I taught you to do. You told the truth. I don't know if it was worth it," Clara said quietly. "They're talking about firing me. People online are fighting like I started a war." Her mother sighed, the sound full of both love and fatigue. "Every fight for dignity feels like that. But don't let them make you think silence is peace." The words stayed with her all day. Meanwhile, across town, Victor sat in his penthouse office facing a different kind of pressure. His company's stock had dipped. His board of directors wanted answers. His public relations team begged him to issue another apology, one that sounded authentic, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Every draft they showed him felt hollow, rehearsed. He told himself it was all exaggerated. That he had made a mistake, yes, but not one worth destroying his name over. Still, Clara's voice haunted him in quiet moments. "You spoke to me as if your money made you untouchable." The more he thought about it, the less sure he was of anything. For the first time in his career, control felt like something he didn't possess. Back at the restaurant, the tension grew. Some coworkers avoided Clara, afraid her situation might draw unwanted attention. Others whispered words of support when the manager wasn't looking. Her friend Mia pulled her aside one afternoon. "You know I love you, Clara, but maybe you should just let this go. People like him, they always win." Clara looked at her, weary but unbroken. "Maybe they win because we stop fighting." The day ended quietly, but the silence felt charged, alive. As she walked home, the city lights shimmered in puddles along the sidewalk, reflecting both beauty and exhaustion. Every step echoed with the cost of what she had done, the loss of comfort, the risk of reputation, the fear of standing alone. But beneath it all, there was something else: resolve. Clara stopped at a crosswalk, staring at her reflection in a shop window. She looked tired, but there was a strength in her eyes she hadn't seen before. The kind that came not from winning, but from refusing to surrender. She knew this was only the beginning. Speaking out had opened a door she couldn't close, and walking through it would change everything. The world might punish her for it. Power might try to silence her, but dignity, real dignity, demanded persistence. Clara took a deep breath and crossed the street. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall. The cameras flashed like judgment itself. Victor Westbrook stood at the podium, flanked by the emblem of his company and a row of microphones. The press room buzzed with tension, reporters whispering, cameras adjusting. The quiet hum of anticipation before a public fall. His suit was immaculate, but his expression carried the weight of sleepless nights. He cleared his throat. "Good afternoon," the room stilled. This was the moment everyone had come for. The billionaire CEO who had mocked a waitress, now facing the world that had seen him unmasked. "I've called this press conference," Victor began, his voice lower than usual, "to address my actions and the harm they caused." His PR team had urged him to keep it brief, to focus on optics. But something inside him refused the script. He looked down at the written notes before him, then folded them neatly and set them aside. "I was wrong," he said simply, "not just for what I said that day, but for what it revealed about me. About how I've lived, about the kind of world I've helped build." The air thickened. He continued, each word landing with the slow gravity of confession. "For years, I believed that success excused cruelty. I saw people as steps, not souls. I used words like weapons and thought that power meant immunity. But it doesn't. Power only means responsibility, and I've failed mine." A reporter raised a hand, but Victor kept speaking, his voice trembling slightly now. "This isn't about public image. It's about accountability. I disrespected a woman who showed me more dignity in silence than I have shown anyone in years. I mocked her. And by doing so, I mocked every person who's ever worked hard without recognition." Outside the glass walls of the press room, Clara Bennett watched from a distance. She stood on the sidewalk, among strangers who had gathered around the large screen showing the live broadcast. The cold wind brushed against her face, but her focus was sharp. She saw a man trying to rebuild something he had broken, but she also saw the system standing behind him. The suits, the cameras, the corporate logo, all symbols of the same world that had protected him for so long. Victor paused, gripping the sides of the podium. "To Ms. Bennett," he said finally, "and to everyone who has ever been belittled by people like me, I am sorry." For a moment, silence blanketed the room. Then the reporters erupted, questions flying, flashes blinding, the noise of a spectacle consuming sincerity. Clara turned away. The apology echoed through headlines within hours. Westbrook apologizes, a new chapter of redemption? Some called it brave. Others called it strategic. To the world, it was an event. To Clara, it was an echo. Words without weight unless followed by change. That night, she sat by her apartment window, the city glowing beneath her. She replayed the speech once more. There had been truth in his tone, yes, regret. But she knew what came after speeches like this. Meetings, statements, rebranding. Apologies were easy. Systems were not. Still, something inside her softened, not in forgiveness, but in recognition. Even the powerful could be cracked open by truth. Even arrogance could bend, if not break. Clara looked down at her reflection in the glass. She was still the same woman, the same waitress, the same voice, but now she understood her power. The incident had started with an insult, but it had revealed something far greater. A mirror held to a culture that needed to see itself. Outside, the wind carried faint city sounds, cars, laughter, the rhythm of ordinary life continuing. Clara leaned back, letting the stillness settle. Victor Westbrook had spoken. The world had listened. But the reckoning was only beginning. And this time, Clara intended to make sure the truth didn't fade into silence. The storm had passed, but the ground was forever changed. Clara Bennett stood outside the restaurant that had once been the center of her world. The sun was rising over the city, streaking the glass buildings with gold. Inside, the tables gleamed as if nothing had happened, yet everything had. Her days as a silent observer were gone. The confrontation, the viral storm, the apology, it had all rippled outward. Customers still whispered her name. Journalists still tried to find her, and activists had begun calling her story a spark. But Clara knew sparks could fade. Real change took time and sacrifice. After Victor Westbrook's public apology, the company had tried to offer her a settlement, a quiet way to make the noise stop. But Clara refused. She didn't want their money. She wanted accountability. She had started speaking at small gatherings, church halls, college events, worker advocacy meetings. Her words were simple, steady, always circling back to the same truth. Dignity should not depend on status. People listened. Some even cried. For the first time, Clara saw her pain transforming into something powerful, something that could outlast the headlines. But the cost was real. Some days she still faced backlash. Anonymous messages told her to move on, to be grateful. Some friends drifted away, afraid of being caught in controversy. The restaurant eventually let her go, citing public distraction. Yet even in loss, Clara felt a strange calm. The fear that once held her captive had no power now. Across the city, Victor lived in a quieter world too, but his quiet was heavier. His company had lost major contracts, his face had become a symbol of arrogance, and the trust he once commanded was gone. In his office, stripped of assistants and endless calls, he sat in silence, reading Clara's public interview on his tablet. She had never mentioned his name, not once. Instead, she had spoken about systems, about behavior, about the small cruelties people overlook every day. It wasn't revenge. It was education. Victor closed the screen and stared at the skyline, the same skyline that once made him feel invincible. For the first time, it looked like a mirror, tall, cold, and full of reflections he could no longer escape. Clara, meanwhile, had begun working with a local advocacy group. She helped restaurant workers file fair pay complaints, spoke to young women about workplace dignity, and lobbied city officials for policy changes. She didn't have wealth or fame, but she had credibility, the kind that comes from truth lived, not spoken. One evening, she sat in a small community center, surrounded by a dozen workers who had come seeking help. The air was warm and heavy with hope and fear. Clara looked at them and saw herself, the exhaustion, the quiet longing for respect. "Change doesn't come fast," she said, her voice low but sure. "It comes when we refuse to pretend everything's fine. It comes when one person says no more, and another joins them." There was a long silence. Then one woman nodded. Another followed. The small group began to talk, not just about problems but about solutions. As Clara listened, she realized something profound. Power wasn't about titles or money. It was about standing firm in the truth, even when it cost you comfort. Especially then. Later that night, as she walked home under the fading city lights, her reflection passed over the darkened windows of a closed shop. For a moment, she caught her own gaze. Strong, tired, unbroken. In that reflection, she saw not a victim, not a symbol, but a leader. Clara smiled faintly, the kind that comes when resolve replaces fear. Change had a cost. She had paid it, and she was just getting started. Is this conversation helpful so far? The noise had faded, but its echo remained. Months had passed since the confrontation that changed everything. The headlines had quieted, the cameras moved on, and the world, hungry for new stories, had found others to consume. Yet for Clara Bennett, the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was peace. She no longer worked at the mariner's table. The uniform that once felt like a cage now hung folded in her closet, untouched, but not forgotten. It was a reminder, a symbol of the day she stopped being invisible. She worked now for a nonprofit that helped service workers facing discrimination. The pay was modest, the hours long, but the purpose was clear. Each call she answered, each person she guided, felt like another small stone added to the foundation of something lasting. Her life was quieter but fuller. She spent her mornings walking through the city, noticing details she once rushed past. The smell of coffee from corner shops, the chatter of early commuters, the rhythm of a world still learning to listen. Sometimes she wondered if Victor Westbrook ever walked the same streets. He was no longer the untouchable figure of corporate myth. His empire still stood, but smaller, leaner. Some said his downfall had humbled him. Others said it had hardened him. The truth, Clara suspected, was somewhere in between. Victor had disappeared from the public eye after his apology, retreating from cameras and headlines. But one quiet afternoon, a letter arrived at Clara's new office. No logo, no signature beyond a simple VW. You were right. I spent years thinking power made me immune to consequence. I'm still learning how wrong I was. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know. I see it now. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Not as a trophy, but as a record, proof that even the unlikeliest hearts could shift. The following week, she stood before a small group of young workers gathered at a community center. Some were nervous, others angry, all carrying their own stories of quiet humiliation. Clara began to speak, her voice measured, calm. I used to think silence was safety, she said, that if I just stayed small, the world would leave me alone. But silence protects no one. Dignity doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand firm. The room was still, faces lifted. In those eyes, she saw what her mother had once told her. That truth, once spoken, doesn't vanish, it spreads. Later, walking home beneath the soft glow of streetlights, Clara felt the cool air brush her skin like a benediction. The world hadn't changed overnight. The wealthy still held their power, injustice still lingered. But cracks had formed in the walls that once felt unbreakable. Clara smiled faintly. Real victory, she realized, was rarely loud. It didn't demand applause or recognition. It lived in the quiet persistence of people who refused to forget their worth. She paused at a crosswalk, her reflection glinting faintly in the glass of a nearby window. The woman who looked back at her was older, wiser, and finally free. The light turned green. Clara crossed, steady and unhurried, moving forward into the night. Some victories shout, hers whispered, but the world was listening.